learning and development.
And hi, Nicole from Michigan. So glad you could join us. We're really excited today about the topic. Alexis and I, thank you so much, Nicole. Alexis and I work together often, and so it's always a joy to be able to present. Hello, Michelle from Western New York. We are, of course, sitting in for Kathy. She's unable to make it today. I'll also be with you again on Friday for that webinar. Hi, Luan from DC. Ashley from
Hello,
Crystal
LA.
Stairs in Los Angeles. I love your organization. So we're going to go ahead and while people continue to come in and just put in the chat, today we're going to have a really great conversation about workplace communication and culture and how culture informs workplace communication. Hi, Internet. Hi, Todd from Chicago. Next slide, please. So, for those who are familiar, you know the ways, and those who are new, and you're joining us, the ways to engage with us on this webinar is that if you're already on mute, but if you would like to talk, when you're ready to comment, you just raise your hand and we'll unmute you, and then you'll need to unmute yourself. We ask that you please be patient with us, particularly when we're sharing in the chat, because sometimes they come really fast. So we try to get most of the comments. Feel free to type your comments in the group chat and make sure again that it's going to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see it. Hi, Anna. And so then we have these agreements to ensure that we are having a great peer-to-peer learning and a safe place for these webinars. So we want everyone to speak from their own experience, use I statements. Of course, we operate under the golden rule. We're going to treat each other the way we would like to be treated. And we would like for you to bring your full presence to the webinar. So no multitasking. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Alexis to begin.
Okay, 1 second.
And yes, everyone, please put, well, Alexis, I agree. I see some people are already doing it. Thank you. I'm also going to type that I agree. Hi, Jennifer Johnson.
So we wanted to start today talking about how we got here. Why is Be Strong Families hosting um, our webinars on equity audits, allyship, intercultural communication in the workforce? In 2019, in the before times, as I like to say, we did our strategic plan for the next 3 years. And one of our big priority areas was looking at and working on equity, intercultural competence, and inclusion at Be Strong Families. And one of the steps that we took in 2020 to help us move forward on this path was to do a engage with a tool called the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is a framework and a set of surveys that helps us understand as individuals and as an organization how far along we are to having an intercultural mindset. And so the framework is here on the screen. You'll see the arrow. We're really wanting to move from a monocultural mindset to an intercultural mindset. And we can go to the next slide and talk about what it means to be um, having an intercultural mindset. That the intercultural mindset allows you to make sense of cultural differences and things that are similar to your own culture. It allows you to understand um, and excuse me, to have a deeper understanding of cultural difference and commonalities. And so we found in our work that this is really important for us to dig into a bit because Be Strong Families and the way we work, we're really looking for what we have in common, what practices and policies and trainings and content that we could share in the world that we know is going to be of help to people no matter where you come from. And that's a wonderful thing. And we are very proud of the work that we do using that lens or that mindset. The other piece that that goes along with that we wanted to build up was understanding cultural differences and how we can be adept in working with that, so that we create a more inclusive experience, or so that we adapt materials and tools in a way that makes sense for the people that we're working with. And so, as you can see, maybe from the way that we speak about this, it's not right or wrong or the majority rules or there's only one way to be and one way to do things. It's really about, and we can go to the next slide, it's really about having this understanding that allows you to understand differences, appreciate them, and work with them. And we really, you'll see from this conversation, we're approaching this work from the space of mutual adaptability, meaning that we all have something to learn, we all have something to contribute. So no right or wrong, no blaming, shaming, um, or fixing kind of thing. Um,
And so I just wanted to say, just add on, Alexis, like one of the things that through this process as we've been leading our organization or co facilitating around diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we started looking at communication styles, is that understanding that different communication styles, especially when there isn't awareness of how culture influences it, can trigger these emotional reactions, and that's perfectly normal, right? But then how do you then um, maneuver through that, understand that, and then be able to react differently with your coworkers when you have these different cultural influence communication styles. So trying to make sure we understand that role that culture plays, so we're not frustrated, that we're not being in a space where we're having all of these barriers simply because we don't understand that someone is showing up and communicating within their cultural identity. Also, we wanted to examine our own biases, right? We all have biases, cultural expectations that can make sure that we're not making assumptions and generalizations when we have these intercultural interactions. And then just make sure once we have that as a foundation, how can we be more intentional about creating this inclusive environment? Next slide, please. So cultural identity, just so we have a working and shared vocabulary, it's race, gender, sexuality, and ability are all cultural identities, right? They all affect how we show up in relationships and how we communicate within those relationships, whether personal or professional. And then that race, gender, sexuality, and ability are socially constructed cultural identities that have developed over time in relation to the historical, the political, and social context within a society. Next slide. Thank you, Tamara. Some good biases. She shared with us a resource, some good bias self-tests.
Yeah,
And
I have a note about that before we move on real quick. I say use those tests with caution, not because they're not useful or accurate, but because it's very helpful to have somebody to support you to understand your results, because the results will tell you where your biases are, and then it's most helpful to know where to go from there. So it can feel very alienating and disappointing, honestly, sometimes, to look at your results and say, oh, wow, I have this huge bias. Now what do I do? Or where does this come from? So I personally, when I do this work around equity, intercultural competence, and inclusion, I really think it's so important, so crucial that we don't come from a place of blaming or shaming, but really trying to understand our training.
Ashley made a really great point, and it's something that Alexis and I talk about all the time. Is that religion is kind of implied within these definitions, but it's not explicit.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important note that religion is a part of someone's cultural identity. And there's also a few other things that, just through our own practice where we say that these definitions could, be broadened a little bit. And then uh, Olesor, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, said respect is everything. Yes, agreed, Ashley. But in our work, we are talking about religion as a part of culture, and also religious biases, because we do think that's important, because that is something that shows up, that's beyond race and gender, etc. It's one of those things that's actually a part of what happens in our society. So in the chat, we wanted you to share one thing you appreciate about a cultural group to which you do not belong. We also want to stay away from things like food. That's a lot of times. So I really like the food. But something that's a little bit a little bit deeper, that you appreciate. And so, while you all are thinking about um, what you're going to answer, I'll share my answer, one of my answers, and I think one of the cultural groups that I really appreciate is Chinese culture, specifically around the art and spirituality and philosophy of martial arts. I'm a huge martial arts fan, so it's not just the exciting action, but the discipline and the philosophy and the self-awareness and accountability that all undergirds Chinese martial arts, Japanese martial arts. It's just always been something I truly appreciate, and I think is very valuable for everyone, no matter their cultural identity. So I'm gonna see some of these things in the chat. We have Nicole. She says, "I love Native American culture, the storytelling and respect for elders." Agreed. Chiffon said, "Oh, she agreed." The belief system, how they view the earth. Susan said, "The passion and sense of belonging of Baptist churches and where they are primary Black congregants." Agreed. I'm a PK of a Black Baptist preacher, actually 6 generations. So I definitely understand Susan. Alexis says the arts and spirituality. She put my answer in. Allison said, "I really appreciate how meaningful the family and community unit is within the Hispanic Latinx culture." Amanda says, "It seems as though there's great respect and reverence for senior citizens within some Asian cultures. I really appreciate that." Carolyn says the arts, the musics, the instruments, the dance, the celebrations. Alessor, please, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Openness to others, dance and celebration. Tracy says she really appreciates the Native American powwows. They are very similar to my cultural family reunions. Interesting connection. Ashley said, "I really enjoy witnessing Kashmiri cultural practices around gatherings and tea." Oh, I would love to know more about that. Japanese samurai culture is so intriguing. Their honor, loyalty, and bravery. I agree, Maria. Ashley said the women drumming circles, and Tina said the Hispanic Latinx culture, dances, and coming of ages ceremonies. Thank you so much. There's so much great feedback. We appreciate you all participating. Jennifer says, the multi-generational living and family support within many cultures, specifically Latinx, Chinese, and Black African American cultures. Thank you, everyone. Next slide, Andrew. And we've got to say Andrew is with us in the background, being our awesome tech support. Got to acknowledge you, so we really appreciate him.
Awesome. So we're going to go into now asking you to think about a time when you're in communication with someone with a cultural identity different than your own. What happened? What was rewarding? What was challenging? And how did you work through the challenges, if any? So I'm going to talk about an experience I had as a student, undergrad. I was put into a group assignment, which, you know, we all have those. I was put into a group assignment with 4 other women, a couple Latinx, like myself, and I believe a Vietnamese, Asian young lady, a Vietnamese American woman. And we got into the group, and we were trying to decide a direction for our assignment, what to do. And the Vietnamese student had a lot of really strong ideas and was coming to the group with them in a very forceful way. And I was like, oh, wow, I didn't expect that. She's like the leader of this group, or stepping in to lead this group. And I had to reorient all my perceptions, because somewhere along the line, I had absorbed this idea that she was going to be passive or submissive. And luckily, I caught myself really quickly on that one, and I was horrified. But my first reaction was like, why is this person taking up so much space in this group? And then I was like, why is that bothering me? She's taking leadership. She's leading us in a group. Every group this group needs a leader. And I really had to walk myself back from that initial emotional reaction. Luckily, I'm kind of a thoughtful person. So I didn't like respond back right away, like, trying to come head to head with her. I was like, all right, let me check this out, see what's happening. And it was a real wake up call for me, and really important learning for me.
Now, Ashley said that, yes, I've been there. I now have many Asian friends of many backgrounds involved in various organizing effort, and they have worked it out. They have worked it all out of me. Yeah,
I love
isn't
that.
that great? And you can feel free to put this in the chat, but we would love for someone to take a minute and join in the conversation. So if you raise your hand, you can also answer these questions with us and come online. We'd love to hear your voice.
Yeah, and I'm realizing now that I said that I'm like blushing a little bit over here, because it's not nice to admit those kind of things about yourself sometimes.
But so important, and I think it models the behavior in this work, right? That we all have work to do. There's always, back to what you were saying about the shame it and blame it. It doesn't matter your racial identity, your gender identity, your religious identity. Like, we all have biases. We all show up with these biases. And I think self accountability and modeling that is extremely important if we're really going to do this work and not be at the surface level with it. So thank you, Alexis. Models of how human we are. Yes, Ashley said it's so important. The models how human we are. She also put a link. Interesting. I'm gonna have to. It's Black
Yeah.
and Asian. I have to check that out. Thanks for sharing, Ashley. Brooks said, I was expecting to be the audit, the equity audit. Yes. Unfortunately, you are in the right place, but Carol wasn't able to be here with us today, so we're stepping in. So thank you for those of you who did sign up for the equity audit. We did try to be proactive and send out an email. It may have not reached you. Thank you so much for still joining us. So we kept it around, equity and inclusion, but it's not the equity audit. So hopefully we'll be able to reschedule that and that tool for you able to use with your organization. So do we have any raised hands? No brave soul is going to join us?
We have 3 raised hands.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so who's first, Andrew?
I will unmute the first person.
Hello. Hi. Thank you.
I work at the Community Parents Resource Center. I work mostly with bilingual Chinese families, Chinese-speaking families. But I've noticing that during the pandemic, even before the pandemic, this culture or subculture of domestic abuse. And so I wanted to bring that up. Culture can be that of I think, abusive culture, or families who are used to domestic abuse and not feeling like they can tell anyone about that, and learning to and have a lot of trauma associated, not just the parent who's approaching us, but the children living in that culture, that abusive culture, adds another layer to the language. And I've also worked with other women from other culture who have been adversely impacted by the abuse cycle, physical abuse and emotional abuse.
Thank you for sharing. Interesting perspective, because I think, having worked with families as well across cultures around domestic violence, there are definitely some, I think, that silencing of self, it probably is maybe more prominent in some cultures, but I've kind of seen that as a commonality, even in the work that I've done with African American families. So thank you for sharing that. Is there the next person I think we have up is?
Yep, I'll unmute her. This is Maria.
Hi, Maria.
Hello. I didn't want to type it because it would take me too long. But
Mhm.
I was just thinking in like the day-to-day stuff, right? When we talk about communication in different cultures. Yesterday I ordered food and the restaurant is known as traditionally being a Greek restaurant. Well, the person that picked up the phone to get my order had a very thick accent. And it was difficult for her to understand me and for me to understand her. What happened was I like paused. I thought about like not being reactive and being like, listen, just say it slower. You know what I'm saying? Like say it where we're talking on the phone first off, and God only knows if she can hear me clearly because I hear it kind of muffled myself. So I said it
Mhm.
slower. I showed her respect. I didn't get angry. I didn't change my tone or get agitated. I just said it slower. And I repeated it a couple of times just to be sure. And what her response is like, thank you so much. You're awesome. Had I been reactive to her, she probably has to deal with that. You know what I'm saying? On a more regular basis. Had I been reactive to her, that would have been so disrespectful and I wouldn't be honoring her because she's doing her job. It's just a
Yeah,
matter of, this is how she speaks, and I need to be sensitive to that.
I love that. I think that's a great example of humility, right? And lucky for me lately on one of the projects that I do away from my time with Be Strong Families, I am in a group of native Spanish speakers and my Spanish is not that good. So talk about learning some deep empathy for, somebody in their second language, showing up in their second language. And also the other thing that you said, Maria, that is coming up too is the technology, right? You're on the phone, you're on Zoom. We have to take extra time and care to make sure that we understand each other, whether somebody speaks accented English or not, right? The technology adds another layer that we have to be mindful of.
For sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really quickly before we get to Carolyn, who's up next, Jennifer says, sometimes I realize after or during conversations that I'm using the wrong names for different cultural identities. So I'm always learning. Thanks for sharing that. And then Terry said, awesome way of showing respect towards others. Chandra agreed that you had a really good example, Maria. And then hi, Pam, welcome. And so we have Carolyn up next.
Thank you. Alexis, you triggered a memory for me when you mentioned as an undergrad that you had an experience. As an undergrad, I had a substitute teacher in one of my classes who was a small person. And he came into class and sat on top of the desk at the front of the classroom and says, I just want you all to know that you are tabs. And of course, we all looked at each other without understanding what he was saying. And he explained, you are temporarily able-bodied individuals. At any
Ooh,
point, you could become someone with exceptional needs. And that has stuck with me for many, many years. Remembering that experience, I don't even remember what class it was, but that experience has reminded me not to make assumptions and to try to remember to walk in someone else's.
that's brilliant.
That's awesome. And that was a learning experience for me, the temporarily able-bodied person. I love that. Alexis put that in, and I think we have Ashley um, up next, if I remember correctly. Yes, Ashley.
Hello, you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
hi.
Okay. Yes. So I think Maria actually triggered a memory for me. I remember when I was teaching in Morocco, I used to correct some of my students' English. Like they spoke so many languages, and I had the nerve to actually like almost police like the way that they were pronouncing English, and I saw it show up in myself a few times even after that when working with like immigrant origin communities. It's just like a reflex that I had to really call in with myself because when you're similar to her experience on the phone, it can be particularly harmful to someone that is learning this language, learning the culture of the United States in the case of immigrant origin families that we're serving. And then they see this policing behaviors of those that are saying that they're serving them, but also being extremely harmful. So it's something that I feel like I can continue. I feel like we're always working on it, but it was really something that I realized was a big problem for me in that past.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Ashley. Yeah, that's great. We have one more, Carolina. Oh, Carolina.
Yes. Hi. Like a person with accent, English is my second language. I work with families, with Hispanic families, and then they are very aware of their accent, and sometimes it's a shame for them. When the people cannot understand them. But I always talk about how have accent is portrayed for people. For me, I am very proud to have accent. That means that I talk two languages. That is it's a huge thing for me. I mean, it has been very, very hard to be able to navigate the English language, with all the different rules and all that kind of stuff. But I think if we, like a society, change the chip and is instead to see the accent like, oh my God, I can't understand what she's saying. We see a person that, wow, she or he talks at least two languages. That's why she or he have accent. I think that our mind could change a little bit the way that we perceive the accent that sometimes is very difficult to understand. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have one more. We're gonna sneak in because we have a lot of other great conversations to have. But Nicole, since you had your hand raised, we wanted to be able to acknowledge you and have you share.
I was just going to put in, my dad is from Mexico, and he has a very strong accent as well. And he only has a second grade education because when he came up here, he had to work the fields. And so he comes from 15 siblings and he was the oldest. And one of the biggest things is that my father runs into a lot of problems where people do not have stuff written in Spanish for him to be able to communicate effectively, because he cannot really understand stuff written down in English. And there's not a lot of grace, at least in Michigan, for him. And so it can become very embarrassing for him if he has to do anything at doctor's offices or, anything with paperwork is always very frustrating and embarrassing for him. And so I always try to be mindful of my job that I do when I work with Hispanic families, is making sure that there is a translator, making sure that there is stuff in Spanish for them to be able to understand more, because I think that that is really something that we forget as a culture here in America. And it's also something that is really embarrassing for him, and it shouldn't be.
Totally agreed. That's one of the things I think that we take very seriously at Be Strong Families. Every one of our parent cafes, we make sure they're translated into Spanish. We've also had them translated into Arabic and Chinese, because if you want your services and your initiatives to be effective, then you need to be able to speak to people in a language that they understand and be respectful and graceful. So I really appreciate that comment. Norma says we are a multilingual population. U.S. people, U.S. people are learning to understand how to live with diverse people. And then Ashley gave us some resources. Thanks again for sharing. Next slide. So how do we create an inclusive environment? We hear that. What does that really, really mean? It means that you are intentional about your practices and your policies, that you're going to provide equal access to opportunities and resources, basically what was just shared from Ashley, for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those who have physical or mental different capabilities, and members of other minority groups. This is the working definition in the DEI lexicon. But I think, one of the things, like a lot of people signed up today for the equity audit, that is a way to be intentional about making sure that you're creating this inclusive environment. Also using some type of tool organizationally to assess where you are as an organization. A lot of times I think too, when we are in these multicultural environments, it's easy to assume that we have it all worked out. just by virtue of the staff being diverse, and that is far from the case. You have to be intentional. It's not just who you hire and why, it's how you make sure that everyone's voice is heard and that how they show up and bring their full presence and their culture is not shunned upon. And to what I think is extremely important that Alexis said earlier is in this work, because this is hard work, right? If you're doing this work for real, it's hard work, that we're not blaming or shaming anyone, that we're all understanding that we're all a work in progress and that we're all learning from each other. Yes, Ashley, yeah, Alexis added marginalized groups, because yeah, I'm one of those people out that's like one of my little catchwords, but we also want to make sure that, you know, even in this work, you see it's constantly changing, the names are changing, things are being upgraded, for lack of a better word. Next slide, please, Andrew.
So I can take this one. So today we were really talking about verbal communication, or in-person communication rather than, or person-to-person communication rather than written communication. Although that would be really interesting too, to talk about how that creates access, because that is something we pay attention to in our own work also. And if you're in social services, the level of the language is really important, right? Are we using the academic practitioner language, or are we using everyday language? So now we're getting ideas for another webinar in this series, but for today, I'll go through the elements of communication. So only 7% of our communication to another person is verbal elements. That's the words, and maybe that's the accents and the sounds. A huge portion of it is nonverbal. So 38% of that is the volume, the pitch, the rhythm, and the tone of your speech, right? Many of us who are parents or who have been parented know that when your parent says, "Oh, come on over here, sweetie, I want to talk to you," that's one thing. When, you know, your mom or your auntie or your granny busts out your full 3 names and says, "Get over here right now," right? We know how the tone changes. We know what that means, right? So much of what we understand from communication is the volume, the pitch, the rhythm, and the tone. And then when we are in person, which, you know, we will go back there soon, I hope. A parent says our government name. That's a great way to talk about it. 55% of the elements, even in the online environment, are physical elements. So if I'm looking at you like this and I say, "That's a great point, Ashley," that means one thing. And if I say, "I don't know about that, Alexandra," you know, like that, it's different message, different understanding, right? Here's where culture and religion comes in too as well. I might, you know, in Muslim cultures or in other cultures, touching between opposite members of the opposite sex who are not related, not close relatives or married, is a strict no-no. So if you're doing that, you're breaking a taboo and crossing boundaries that are very, very important. Another one that came up when I was doing this research that was so interesting to me is that in some cultures, showing somebody the bottom of your shoe is a sign of extreme disrespect. So if you're in person with that person, I believe this is in the Middle East in some countries. If you're in person with somebody and you're sitting there and maybe you decide to cross your legs and get comfortable, you inadvertently show somebody in the bottom of your shoe, that's like a middle finger in those cultures, right?
Wow.
It's like serious breach of etiquette and protocol. We also talk facial expressions, gestures, and how close you stand to somebody. I've had the experience myself of talking to somebody and they're just creeping closer and closer and closer. And I'm sitting there hearing their words, but I'm trying to understand, are they from a different culture? Does this mean they like me? We're vibing, we're in the conversation together. If it's, you know, does it mean, are they trying to intimidate me? Like trying to understand what those. Okay, we have some good comments. You want to get in there, Alex, with the comments?
Yeah, sure. And I just let me see. Ashley says also, I would expand on the cultures in my house: Arab, African, Muslim. Places in the homes are off limits, and it um, is also for
The culture of the Emirates.
it's a culture of the Emirates. Okay, and then oh, so certain places in the house is a continuation of Ashley. It's rude to enter. Um, and for Nicole added for the bottom of the feet. And I
Mhm.
know, like in general, regardless, those, Americans, we have a different view of space, of our space, than other people. And I think we have to sometimes be careful not to project that onto other people, like what we think is the proximity. The other element of communication is I have a very lower register voice. So a lot of times when I'm on the phone, like for professional, people always call me sir. And it just really like irritates me. And I have to constantly say, like, I say my name is Alexandra. They hear my voice and they say Alexander. And I'm like, I'm a woman. And they're like, oh, or sometimes they don't hear me and they keep saying, so even sometimes outside of the language barrier, it's just like the whole tone piece. Like that happens to me all the time. And I'm like, I think I sound like a woman. I don't know. And a lot of times it's people who are outside of African American and African culture where that happens to me, where the voice pitch and tone becomes an issue.
Okay.
Ashley said that
Awesome.
Zoom school was hard for us because it was first an invasion of what we
Ah.
valued as private space. Oh, great point, Ashley. Very interesting. Yeah. I don't think
Yeah.
we've even thought about that yet. I hadn't in terms of being in this online world, how that may cross into cultural boundaries and no-nos. Next slide, Andrew.
So yeah, the reason that we call this all out is that, we all have these norms that either we're raised with or we're trained in, or that we have to learn if you're in a new country or culture. And sometimes we're not even aware that these things are so ingrained in us until something bumps up against them. So that's what this is a great discussion to help us see that. So in terms of cultural norms, this is just jump in the chat if any of this resonates with you. How would you feel if someone does not make eye contact with you or shows no facial expression? How would you feel if someone you are talking with touches you repeatedly? How would you feel if someone you are talking with shares stories every time they are asked a question or they get a chance to speak?
So while people are thinking, Tina brought up another excellent point about the proximity. She said that sometimes she has a hard time hearing in the group situation. So she's not even really violating. She's just getting closer to hear, which is also an equity and an access, right? Very interesting. May says, I want them to please look at me. Yes. As an African American, I've taught if someone does not look me in the eye, that means I can't trust them, which is not what I have learned, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's a sign of respect for someone not to look at you. But in my culture, like if you don't look someone in the eye, you're like, you're shady, quote unquote. This the talking and sharing stories every time. Definitely, it doesn't bother me, right? Because I come from a culture, this like a storytelling culture. But then, we really, one of the interesting things that we did in one of these professional developments is we took this survey that Alexis found that was really about our cultural styles and how that like shows up and whether you are someone that, so the spectrum was like, do you like to share stories? And it was all within the context of work, or you rather just be straight to the point. And it's not like either one. And in general, it's not like either thing is right or wrong. It's just a different way of expressing yourself. So Ashley says, I'm more flexible about eye contact and not pressuring my kids. I have children on the spectrum who is overstimulated at greetings. Morgan says, I look away a lot when I'm talking to others because it makes me uncomfortable to make eye contact. For me, it's too intimate. But Ashley said she was raised to give eye contact. And then Susan says, I have a hard time with that because I'm more straight to the point and I really have to work on that and being patient. Thank you so much, Susan. And Terry has their hand raised. Terry, welcome.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good. How are
Good,
you?
good.
Okay, so speaking of like the volume and pitch, I have a friend. She would speak loudly to her mom, and people thought she was being rude, not knowing that her mom was deaf in one ear, and that's why she had to speak loudly to her. So sometimes we can make those assumptions, but not have all the information as well.
Great, great, great point. Great point, Terry. I so appreciate that. Because it talks that that speaks exactly to like what do we do and how do we show up. We don't want to make people have to change their cultural norms. It's about how do we show up, and kind of like exactly what Susan said, like what can I do to make this easier? I'm going to be patient. And so Maria says the area I struggle with is sharing stories all the time, as I appreciate it, but not all the time. I guess it depends on the situation, but I want to get to the point. So agreed. And even in this in the survey that we took, it was like a spectrum, right? And so a lot of people, it's situational. As much as it doesn't bother me if someone tells stories, but if we're like trying to do something, and one of the things that came out in our professional development was, so maybe instead of just being annoyed by the stories, you start off with, hey, I only have 15 minutes. I only have 10 minutes to cover this, this, and this. So then that way it's upfront, and the person, and as a person who is a storyteller, if someone tells me that, then I'm going to get straight to the point, because I toggle between both of them. So thanks
Yeah,
for
same
sharing.
for here. And I think the other thing that we're starting to think about is what is our organizational culture, right? Is it more in the middle? Is it more to storytelling, or more to the linear, making a point, getting to the point right away? This was a struggle for me as a young first generation professional. My parents did not work in office or professional work. My mom was a teacher's aide and for a little bit, and my dad was a contractor. So I had to learn as a first gen white collar professional, what were the norms of communication in an office. And so I've since come to find out that a lot of our organizational culture in nonprofit, in government, in education is white organizational culture, meaning that it mirrors the values of the dominant US culture. And so for me, I sometimes feel like I'm dancing between, if I'm with my own folks, I'm telling stories all the time, but I have to be variable, like Alex said.
Definitely. So I think everyone who has shared, we're going to go to the next slide, Andrew.
So this is just a list of the cultural norms around communication. Some of these you might be familiar with, and we covered them just a moment ago. I think the verbal stuff, we have a little bit more nuance here that I think Alex can talk really well about for us.
Yeah, so right, I don't have an accent, right? Well, maybe I have a southern, I'm in Virginia, a middle east, as we say, on the mid coast accent. But I do speak in Ebonics, which is its own dialect. I attended Howard University, and we had a whole course, especially when Ebonics, this is in the 90s, some age of myself. But there was a whole conversation, and they did a study, and what they found is that Ebonics carries some of the same rules of African languages. So it's not just this random thing. It's a dialect. And so I really identify with what Alexis says, having to be able to split between the two, and when to use it and when not to edit. And then I think one that's really big for us in this setting, because we are either families or people who partner with to serve families, is the professional jargon, right? When we're talking. And I would add even the acronyms. I struggle sometimes when like I'm in a new space and people are just like rumbling off like acronyms, and I'm like, what is that? I don't know what that acronym means. But the social work language, which I think was one of the things where we were really intentional, because in the co-creation of the Parent Cafe and talking about the protective factors, there was, as the story goes, because I wasn't here at the time, but there was a parent that kind of stood up and said, look, you need to make this stuff plain. Like, we need this information, so make it plain so we can understand it. And I think that's extremely important when we're working within families and communities, to make sure that we're translating, not because of anybody's ability to understand, but it's that we all are on, that we are accounting for people's different backgrounds and what they're comfortable, so we can all get the same message, right? So then there's the using the stories and the axioms and the parables. That's a lot within my culture. Like we have 1,000 sayings, and then the code switching, right? Everybody, when we move between our own dialect and a dominant language to avoid bias, discrimination, and violence. And then the other things we kind of talked about, and I see there is some chat. I thought it was a little bit chat happening. So yeah, so Andrew said it took me forever to find out what EOD meant. I had to Google it.
Right, end of the day.
Yeah, and I've never really heard that. I'm used to like COB. So you actually just taught me something. Okay, and so next slide. So we had this really great video, and I think in the interest of time, I think we have enough time. We were at 1:44. It's about 2 minutes, so we're going to share this video with you.
Okay.
And
I have a couple comments as we go in. So we talked about some of the more obvious things about communication, right? The volume, what words people use, how close or how loud they speak. The video is really about maybe some of the more hidden, like the cultural values that
really
undermine, that are the
excitement,
foundation of our communication.
enthusiasm, passion. That means that people who don't show that enthusiasm are really considered lesser. We don't typically think of emotion as a source of bias, and that's because we think emotions are hardwired and natural. But our research is really showing that emotions are cultural, that we really use our emotions to judge other people, specifically our ideal emotions. And so we can misjudge and discriminate against individuals because they're not showing the emotions that we value in our culture. So if I come from a culture that just thinks an excited person is the ideal, and I am interviewing somebody who comes from a culture that values calm, I might just think, well, they just don't have what it takes to be a leader, or they're just not going to be a good fit for this organization. I don't realize that that's because my culture has taught me that being excited is the ideal way, rather than realizing that they're just not fitting with my ideal, and that maybe I should change my ideal, especially if I want to have a multicultural company or I want to be effective in a multicultural marketplace. I do believe as an educator that the first step is knowledge. We've done some preliminary studies where we actually teach clinical psychologists in training about cultural differences in ideal emotions and in definitions of happiness. And we find that they're less likely to use their own ideal emotions when judging the mental health of a patient. Just educating people that cultures and individuals differ in how they want to feel, and that this has consequences for their choices and their even definitions of happiness and health. That makes people more sensitive to it, and I think that reflection can help people, right? So that you're not making this automatic judgment.
So any quick reactions?
Yes, what was your biggest takeaway? You can just add it in the chat. For me, I never really thought about emotions and the expressing of emotions, even though I thought storytelling, right? And storytelling can be emotional, but that how we view emotions and how we play out our emotions are actually a part of our culture. Tracy said that was for me to emotion. Nicole said, I think it's a good reminder for us doing any type of peer support or social work. Yes, agreed, Nicole. Chandra said, very enlightening. I've never considered how emotions were connected to our cultures. Definitely agree. And I think, another thing, I think it's also related to, it's generational.
Yes.
right? Emotions are how you express, you know, generations. Because like my dad is like most of the time very stoic, unless he's like with family and telling the story. But he's very like, and I find it's kind of like in his generation, that's kind of like a norm. Tina says, I tend to verbalize when I've made even a little mistake. I've had some people be annoyed by it. Interesting. Jessica says, so true. I think those are the type of things we're not conscious of most of the time.
So I have a story about this that I would love to share with you, and I'll try to make it as quick as possible. My grandmother's 93, and she's been struggling with Alzheimer's and different health issues over the last decade. But she went to a new doctor at one point in the last 10 years, and he was asking her about all these questions about quality of life and her social supports. But what he asked her was, oh, are you getting out? Are you going to any dances or playing cards? Anybody, you know, that makes you really happy when you're in their company? And all these kind of questions. I wasn't in the room with her, but afterwards she came out and she said, that doctor asked me so many personal questions. I said, really? Like what? If I was going to dances, was I dating anyone? Like, and she was horrified that he was asking her all these personal questions. And I love my grandma dearly. And I, you know, had to stifle my laughter. And I said, Grandma, I think he was really trying to understand if you have a social life that is, because that's so important for so many of us. I don't think he was trying to pick you up or ask you out. She said, oh, I didn't understand why he was doing that. I said, yeah, you were getting really annoyed and bothered, weren't you? She said, I really was.
Oh, that is so, so cute. I can only imagine. Oh, goodness. Siobhan says she agrees with the generational responses in reference to emotions. Definitely. If you're still typing, keep putting what you feel on your reactions in the chat. We're going to go to the next slide. We are at 150. So, what is the most important quality or behavior related to communication of being a good team member in the workplace? So for me, and I think we said this a little bit before, I think self-awareness. This has come out in our time together as the Be Strong family, as an organization. I think self-awareness, right? The things that we've been saying here today, and a lot of, you know, everyone in the chat is very good group about being self-aware, about not imposing or understanding how their biases have shown up. Jesse says, no, Penny said being empathetic. Jesse says active listening, humility, self-regulation, right? Because self-awareness is nothing without self-regulation. Thank you, Jesse. Being sensitive to people who are not from the same background as you. Terry says being kind in how we say things, even if it's a tough topic. Alexis said humility. Carolyn said listening mindfully and intentionally. Yes. And I missed where Ashley says, I'm always interested in cultural values on crying as an appropriate response. Interesting. Tracy Johnson said self-awareness and continuing education on the topic. Ashley says learning how to be together, self-awareness. Nicole says giving people the opportunity to learn, being an active listener, not just listening, but being able to bring it back to the individual so they are aware of that I intentionally listen. Great point. Jennifer, openness to change. And then Lord, I'm not, help me out, be empathetic. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Lourdes, thank you. Ashley, systems for healing from harm and restoring community. So important. Vera said listening to understand. And Bree said, yes, as a child, I had to hide my emotions and not speak or voice my opinion. But honey, now that I've successfully navigated the child well-being system, working now at a law firm. You can't shut me up. I'm making sure all my parents I served in Alameda County find their voices and learn to express themselves, listening and empathy. Thank you so much. I love that, Bree.
That's beautiful.
Next slide, you can keep it coming. Why, and I think some people have said this, but why are these qualities and behaviors important? And I think I just want to reiterate again something that's really important. I think that's come out in the work that we've been doing is having this mutually adaptive practice, right? Where being patient with people where they are. Yes, we want people to understand our cultural identity. Yes, we want people to respect our cultural norms. But I think a really big one for me is the inverse of that is being patient with people. I know I found we have this ever changing terms and what's correct and what's appropriate. I think Jennifer brought this up. And so being patient with people if they haven't quite learned that yet. I think that's the other place that we have to make space for people to learn and for people to grow and for us to be able to grow and learn from each other. So if anyone wants to kind of, add in why you think these qualities and behaviors are important. Carolyn says, so true. You don't know what you don't know. And I totally believe that you cannot hold people accountable for what they don't know. Thank you, Carolyn. For me, these qualities are important because we all know that like communication is like the foundation of teamwork. And if there are issues in communication, it will show up in how productive the work environment is and how safe, right? And how just safe it is for you to feel and to express your ideas. Because if the communication is off, people who are not necessarily who exercise their opinion in a more calm way, they may be shut down. And then you're missing on something so valuable that could contribute to your project or your initiative. And, we think about this like externally, right? We want to model this when we're working with families. And sometimes there's a tendency for organizations not to do it internally.
Yes.
But if we're really doing this work, the external way that we work with families and communities has to be the way that we work within our own organizations and each other.
Okay.
Next slide.
So I think this last question is really put it in the chat, or maybe something that you take away from today with you. Where did you first learn to value the qualities and behaviors that make a good team member? People talked about humility and empathy. And I'm guessing that we learn a lot of those things even before we enter the workplace, hopefully in our families of origin and the families that raised us. But if not there, then there's other kind of defining experiences for you in a religious setting, in a cultural setting, in a classroom setting where these things come from. So the idea here was really just to think about how did you come to value those things? Who showed you or told you that that was the way to be?
And sometimes the way you value these things is because it's been you've dealt with the opposite.
Yes,
right?
That's true.
I think we don't have time, but like Alexis shared a really great story, and I identified with this story. Of sometimes, unfortunately, the public school setting can shut you down when you're learning about what it means to be a good team, a good team player, just with your ability. So within that setting. So Ashley says, I think we learned them in several defining relationships along the way. Elders, community, and life in general will teach you relationships. I think is another really, as far as intimate relationships. If you have any last comments, just keep them coming. We're going to float back between, but next slide. Here's some quick tips and strategies. Alexis?
Yeah, so this is something that our staff came up with as we were going through our professional development about communication and culture. And I'm happy to tell you that all the experts with the big titles agree with us that this is the way to go. Some of the tips and strategies about intercultural communication is start with your mindset. Don't make assumptions about what another person is doing or their intentions. Be mindful and accepting of different communication styles. People talked about that a lot in the chat today, as well as patience and understanding with people who have a different communication style. Embracing the diversity, you might get something you're not expecting. Sometimes I find in the US, in the organizational culture, that we're like asking a question, we think we already know the answer that we're going to get back. So this is the reminder to not do that, to listen to somebody as they go through their thought process or their comments. Another really, really good one, especially in the times we've been living in lately, is recognizing where you are personally, especially your emotional mindset, right? Are you in a place where you can be super patient with somebody? And if you're not, maybe you need to call in some help, or, put some bumpers on the conversation. So really being understanding and being kind and forgiving to yourself, doing your best, but realizing that that changes from day to day. And then we can go next slide of tips and strategies. Recognizing and examining your biases and shortcomings with communication and trying to address them. Several of us shared times that we've had to do that. Educating yourself, and I have some resources at the end of this webinar to learn more about this. In terms of online communications or even over the telephone, we might find that we have to do more spelling things out or being very careful, or having a steady pace than when we're in person together, to make sure that there's understanding on both sides. These are great ones too, very direct, actionable items. Ask clarifying questions and check for understanding. So communication is not just, did you hear me, but did you understand me?
Definitely.
Don't assume what others know. Bring people up to your speed.
Yes. Oh no, continue. We were right at 1:59.
Yeah, and give time and space for others.
And so, Bree, you can get a copy of the webinar. Andrew has put the resources in the chat that you see here. Next slide, Andrew.
Beautiful.
He put them again also, but you'll be able to see those tips and strategies on the website. Next slide. And so upcoming webinars tomorrow, how to keep calm with all the ish going on today. Friday is a recipe for change, best practices for organizing on the outside to see changes in our schools. And then on Monday, accessing our emotions. We'll be back with Yoli. And then of course on Friday, we send out the rest of the webinar. Next slide, please. Hashtag amplify something this week on social media about culture and workplace communication. You want to put it quickly in the chat. Amplify communication. Thank you, Andrew. Next slide. Terry, they will be on the website. And Andrew will put in the chat about that time period. Also, please support us to keep our work going. We have these great masks. They represent with either our logo or with our Amplify campaign. And thank you. If you or your colleagues would like to host a webinar, you can contact us. You can contact our CEO, Kathy, at BeStrongFamilies.net. We appreciate that you were here with us. I know we had to kind of speak through it. It was such great conversation and interaction. So thankful you stayed on. To those of you who stayed on this extra minute, we really appreciate you. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you to my colleague and co-host, Alexis, and to Andrew. We appreciate all of you sharing with us today.
Thank you, everyone. Great to be with